Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. So we're going to talk about some stuff that is super highly requested. We're going to talk about some resin basics. I know, finally, and I have 10 of them for you. I literally wrote them all out. Look at all this. Look at all this. It's like, this is too much. We're just talking about resin. Why do I have a novel about resin basics? Because I want to be thorough, that's why. We're even going to be fancy around here, and I have some pre-filmed clips for you, so when we're talking about something, I will be showing you like a clip of what I'm talking about, so hopefully this will answer a lot of your questions about basic resin stuff. So if you guys are interested in hearing 10 resin basics, resin. So if you guys are interested in hearing 10 resin basics, then continue watching. Okay, we're gonna get into this, but first, look at my really pretty chair. Oh, you can't really see it. Anyway, this place is magical. Do I have to keep talking about it? Absolutely not, but will I? Yes. So my first one on my list is to talk about different resins. There are different resins for different purposes. I only work with CounterCultureDIY resins. I am a brand ambassador for them, so that's why I usually only use their resins. They're amazing resins, but they do have a bunch of different kinds of resin, and I know that a bunch of different companies have different types of resins for different purposes. So casting resins are for casting objects. So if you have more of like a 3D mold, you would want to use a casting resin because they cure in a way that will be able to let it cure without burning too much. For deeper molds, you do have to use a resin that will be able to work with a deeper kind of pour. Obviously, when I do like deep pours, I do it in layers because resins get very hot, but casting resins are made for casting more 3D objects. So the two casting resins that I have for this are regular like culture. Again, I use CounterCultureDIY casting resin. You don't have to use counterculture resins at all. You can totally find your own brand if you want to, obviously. But the two casting resins that I use are the Culture Cast resin, which is the purpley pink label, and then the hard casting resin, which is like the bluer label. So again, these are both casting resins. You can cast 3D objects with this resin. The purple one is more like of a soft curing resin. It cures in 24 hours, but it's definitely not for objects like maybe, you know, bookmarks or anything like that, because when you pour with a resin like that, it can come out very like flexible. So that's where hard cast comes in, and it is really great for casting objects that you need to be hard. And then with CounterCultureDIY, they have the top coating resin. Again, there are other brands that have other top coating resins, but with this brand, it is called Artist Resin. And top coating resins are usually thicker because they're really meant for obviously top coating and finishing a piece and making it look, and I always call it like juicy. I'm sorry if that's like offensive. I feel like everybody hates the word moist. So I don't want to use the word juicy, but that's kind of like what it does in my opinion. It makes things look more amplified and more like brighter, and you can see through it a lot better. So usually top coating resins are thicker. So if you were to use a top coating resin to cast an object, it might not be as good because it is so thick. That means it will be harder to mix up, and that means you get a lot of bubbles. And obviously if you're casting an object, you don't want it to have a lot of bubbles. And you obviously don't want a lot of bubbles when you're top coating something either. But, and I'll touch on this a little bit later, but when you're top coating something, you can use like a higher heat tool, like a torch, to pop those bubbles rather than using a torch in a mold because it will burn the mold. Again, I'll touch on this a little bit later, but you can use a torch when you're top coating stuff, so it's okay that there are bubbles in a top coat, or rather that you while you're mixing it, that you make bubbles. Not that there's bubbles in a top coat, that's not okay, but that you can pop them because you're top coating something and there's no mold involved. Thicker resins are usually used for top coating and finishing a piece, and then thinner resins are usually used for like casting objects. So the next thing I want to talk about is bubbles. Bubbles are the enemy of a resin artist. And I have tried, like, I'm not gonna say everything because there's probably many things I haven't tried, but these are the two things. Actually, I'm gonna say one thing. The one thing that I do that takes care of bubbles. There's one other thing that I know that other people try and suggest to help with bubbles. I don't do it because it just kind of feels messy and kind of like a lot of work. So the one I don't do that often is take a tub of like hot or warm water and put like the jugs of resin in it to kind of warm it up. And this loosens up the resin and will make it easier for you to mix. But I just feel like that's a lot of work, like to fill up a tub, because like I have, you know, gallons of resin. It's just like I have to fill up a tub, like a big tote of warm water and stick them in there. No thank you. I feel like that's a lot, right? So what I like to do is I'll pour both of my resins, you know, into my mixing cup, and while I'm mixing it, I'll point my heat gun and I'll turn it on low. So I'll point it at my cup of resin while it's on low, and while I'm mixing, I have it warm up my resin. So that way, while I'm mixing, it warms it up, it loosens it up, and it makes it easier for me to mix. That way it makes less bubbles. And also the bubbles that it does make, it's easier, since the resin is thinner and easier to mix, it makes it so that the bubbles have an easier time to rise to the top and then pop. So that is my biggest tip for bubbles, is to point your heat gun at it on a low setting. It does not need to be like a crazy amount of heat. Just warm it up a little bit, and then it'll loosen it up, make it easier for bubbles to rise to the top. It'll make it easier for you to mix so there's less bubbles. It's perfect. So the third thing I feel like should have been on the top. I put these in no order at all, no order of like importance or whatever. So I feel like this should have been at the top. But the third one is safety. This is the safety section. I feel like I've never really gone over this because I have not been in a space where it was the right amount of ventilation, so I didn't feel like I could talk about it. But we're talking about it today. So the first thing I'm sure a lot of you will know is wear a respirator. Do not work with resin without wearing a respirator. And I will totally admit that I have not, that I have not been super good at wearing a respirator every single time I work with resin. You know, resin gives off toxic fumes that causes health issues. So you definitely want to wear a respirator. Please wear a respirator when you're working with resin. And also make sure you're equipping your respirator with the right filters. I feel like this was like kind of confusing when I first got into resin to finding the right filters. So these ones are the right ones, and they're for fumes and gases and things like that. Also make sure that they're up to date when you buy them, because I bought mine off of eBay because they are kind of hard to find right now. So I bought mine off of eBay, but when I got them, I made sure that they had the right dates on them. They say 2020 on them, so they're good to go. I'll try to put somewhere on the screen here, somewhere, what exactly they're called. That way you guys can search for it yourselves. So also under safety, wear gloves. Please wear gloves. I have read many horror stories, and again, this is another thing that I wasn't always good at. My first few videos totally have me working with resin without gloves, and I get comments all the time in those videos. Please wear gloves, and they're totally right. Please wear gloves. I've read so many horror stories since of people that did not wear gloves and they started to like get the tips of their fingers. I read one person say that the tips of their fingers started to like really peel, and it can cause a lot of irritation. So please wear gloves when you're working with resin. You totally don't want to get this on your skin at all. And the last safety thing I'll touch on is ventilation. And again, this is one of the things why I didn't talk about safety that much before. Please work in a well-ventilated space. And I know how difficult that can be. Obviously, I was working with resin in my apartment. My apartment is very small. Do not do that if you can avoid it. I would suggest working in a space that is separate from your living space. But yeah, please work in a well-ventilated space, like your garage maybe, or some space outside where there's a lot of ventilation, a lot of airflow. You know, if you have to work inside, use fans to kind of like ventilate the space really well. Because the bottom line is you do not want to be breathing in these fumes. Okay, the next thing on my list is tape. Tape is something I have to have. It's just one of those tools that I use like universally through all of my resin projects. It has so many different uses. So I mainly use it to clean my tools. I use either duct tape, or I've seen people use Gorilla Tape. but I usually use it while I'm cleaning my, reusable cups. Again, we will touch on that in a second, the reusable part. But while I'm using anything silicone, if there's any like cured resin on there that is hard to like scrape off, you can take a piece of tape and kind of like press it on there, and it will pull it right up and it will clean your cups. It'll be perfect. You can reuse them. Again, we will touch on that. And you can also use it, I use this a lot too, or I do this a lot, is you can use it to clean out your silicone molds. Because when I first got into resin, I was doing a lot of things I probably shouldn't have been doing, which is either using my nails, like my fingers, or like a toothpick or something to like pick out either like, little pieces of glitter, dust, or hairs that might have been in my molds. Don't do that. It scrapes your molds. It sucks to have a scraped mold, because then it's like scraped forever, and then when you make a piece with that mold, that scrape comes out in the mold, or in the piece after you take it out of the mold, you know what I mean? So use tape. So I usually take a piece of tape, roll it on itself, and like put my finger in it, and then just like dab it right on the mold, and it picks up all the hairs, all the dust, all the glitter specks that might be on there. So that way you're not scraping it with your fingers, you're not scraping it with a toothpick, you're just lightly dabbing and pulling up any of like the dust particles or whatever may be on there without scratching it. Okay, we're on the reusable tools section. I highly, like so highly recommend finding a reusable cup option. You don't have to use the same option that I use. The one that I do use the most is these like hard plastic measuring cups from the dollar store. They're amazing. Since they're hard plastic, they're a lot easier for me to clean out. So the way that I clean them and I reuse them is that when I'm mixing up resin, I do my project, there's always a little bit of resin that still like sits at the bottom. So I'll leave my popsicle stick in there, my mixing stick, and I'll let the whole thing cure. And then the next day when I come back to it, I can kind of like squeeze the cup until it loosens all the cured resin that's on the side and on the bottom. Sometimes I do have to like hit it on something like the floor or whatever to loosen the bottom. And then you can use the popsicle stick to pull the whole thing out. And then again, I might go back to using tape to kind of like press on the sides and pull any like loose, little bits of resin that's still sticking on the sides right off. And then you can reuse the cup. It's so much better than using plastic cups. And then like throwing them away. I feel like I was doing that for so long and I don't even know why. It was so annoying. It was so annoying to have to like keep buying cups and then throw them away, buy more cups, throw them, like use them and throw them away. It's just not sustainable. So definitely find a reusable cup option. I also use those little like silicone cups. I don't use the big ones because I find them kind of difficult to clean out. But I do use the really small ones for like smaller projects or when I'm top coating like a single piece, but definitely find a reusable cup option. I promise it's so worth it. It's a lot better than using plastic cups. Oh yeah, and I also put here that you can find like silicone mats. I think I've seen them on Amazon. Again, I need to buy myself one. It's like, I keep forgetting to do this, and it's because I've been using a trash bag because resin peels off of trash bags. So I've been using a trash bag forever, and I just keep forgetting to buy a silicone mat. But if you're ever top coating something, it's really nice to have that silicone mat on the bottom. And again, that is reusable. And this trash bag I've been using, I've been reusing it, so that's still reusable. Eventually, if it tears, I might have to, I just need to get a silicone mat. That way, it's 100% reusable. And there's also, I think there's silicone like mixing sticks, which I also want to switch over to because I've been using popsicle sticks and I'm still using popsicle sticks now. So I do need to get myself a silicone mixing stick. Like, I'm wondering if there's any silicone mixing sticks that are like the exact shape of a popsicle stick. That would be ideal. I have to look for that. I'm totally gonna look for that because I feel like that has to be a thing. Okay, so the next thing I wanna talk about is heat tools. And I use 3 different ones. So I have a torch, which I only use for top coating stuff because if you use a torch while you're pouring or trying to make something with a silicone mold, you could and totally will, honestly, I should say you will melt your resin and your mold to each other. So that way when you pull your piece out, you could tear your mold. I cannot tell you how many molds I went through doing this, because I didn't know that that's why that was happening. That's why it was tearing, was because I was using a torch and it was melting things to each other, and then they would tear. So I definitely recommend do not use a torch if a silicone mold is involved at all. I only use a torch when I'm top coating stuff, and again, that is, you know, top coats can withstand like a high heat thing, and they really need a high heat tool to pop those bubbles. So if I'm using, or if I'm making something that has a silicone mold, you know, in a silicone mold, I will use a heat gun instead. It's still heat, it'll still pop the bubbles, but it's not going to melt my mold or melt the resin to each other. And since I've been doing this, I kid you not, I have not torn a single mold, like not a single one. Tearing molds was almost like a regular thing to me. Like, it was so annoying. I was tearing molds like left and right all the time. But since I have switched over to a heat gun for pieces that I'm making in a silicone mold, I have not torn a single mold, and I pinky promise you that. Definitely get a heat tool or a heat gun if you are doing a lot of work with silicone molds. And if you're top coating stuff, you can use a torch for that. And then the other heat tool that I use, it's also called a heat gun, but it's kind of like a high powered one. You can kind of like change up the temperature on it, but you can also, it just has a lot of like air to it. It's more of a hair dryer than the actual heat tool. So I don't use that while I'm making pieces in like silicone molds, because it just blows the resin around too much. But I do use it for when I'm doing like beach wave stuff, or I'm trying to like blow around a color or something. That's what I use that heat tool for, but anything else I don't really use it. All right, my next one is alcohol inks. I get a lot of questions about alcohol inks, and it's so difficult because there's a lot of different resins, and it totally depends on the resin that you're using. I know that I've seen effects that I've even tried myself. I've tried different effects that I've seen other people do, and I can't replicate them, and it's because of the resin that I'm using. So if you're trying to get a certain effect and it's not working, it could be the resin if you're using like the same inks and everything. White alcohol ink makes the colored inks sink to the bottom. If you don't use white alcohol ink and you just drip colored alcohol ink, it will just float at the back of it, and that's kind of it. If that's the look you're going for, totally cool. You don't have to use white alcohol ink, but if you do want like that sinking kind of like lava lamp effect, you will have to use white alcohol ink to get that effect. And I do just want to say that everybody does their inks differently. There's no like, you have to do this. I know I just said like, if you want this effect, you have to use white, but that's just kind of like the base kind of idea of it. Do whatever you want. Try different things, try different effects, because, you know, I've seen people just kind of go for it and come up with a totally different technique that is super freaking cool. The only base idea that you kind of have to carry around with alcohol ink is that white alcohol ink makes colored alcohol inks sink to the bottom. And that's all you really have to like keep in mind, and kind of like form your own style and your own techniques around that. So my next thing is about flowers and resin, and I know not everybody is, you know, doing the same thing that I'm doing, putting flowers in resin all the time. But I just want to touch on this because that's kind of like my main jam, putting flowers in resin. So I did just want to say, if you're going to be putting flowers in resin or anything delicate like that, definitely make sure you're using a slower curing resin. If you use a resin that's too fast curing, it will burn the flower and it'll totally like wipe the flower of its color. So make sure you're using a slower curing resin. The resin that I use for flowers cures in 24 hours. And that's kind of like the perfect pace for me. I have tried a faster curing one, like just a little bit faster. I can't remember how fast it was, but it wasn't like crazy fast. And I was hoping it was gonna work, and it still burnt it. So I would definitely go for a 24-hour curing resin if you're gonna be trying to preserve flowers or anything delicate like that. Okay, so my next thing is about mixing. So what I do is, like I said, I use those hard plastic mixing or measuring cups to mix my resin, and most resins say that you should have a cup, pour your resin, you know, the A and B parts into it. Mix that up for, I think usually the directions say 3 to 4 minutes, and then to pour it into another cup and mix again. I skip that second cup usually because to me, it's just kind of wasteful, and I have never had a problem just mixing it in 1 cup. So I do 1 cup, I pour A and B, and then I'll mix it for like 3 or 4 minutes, and that's kind of it. Or I'll mix it until there's no lines in it. So I'll try to show you guys a clip of what I'm talking about, but whenever I'm mixing resin, it will start to like make lines. That's the 2 parts kind of like, you know, mixing together. So if there are still lines in it, that means that the resin is not fully incorporated into each other yet. So I'll usually mix until those lines are gone and the resin is like 100% crystal clear. But yeah, so I'll mix for like 3 or 4 minutes until all those lines are gone. It's fully incorporated, crystal clear, and then I'll pour it right into my project, whatever I'm doing with it. Whether this is a top coat or pouring it into a mold to make a piece. So I'll totally skip like the second cup thing. Kind of, you know, feel it out for yourself really. If you feel like pouring it into a second cup makes it better, totally do that. Don't feel like you have to just do 1 cup or whatever. I just feel like it, I've never had a problem not doing the 2 cup thing, so I'll stick to the 1 cup. Okay, my last thing, number 10, is literally just go for it. And I know that that's kind of like, really? That's your 10th? That's your last basic for resin? Yes, it is, because I know how intimidating resin is, and when I first started, I feel like I don't know, I felt like, oh, am I supposed to do this? Can I do this? Like, I don't know if this will work. That is one of the top things that people ask is like, will this work? Go for it, try it, because that's how you find out different techniques. That's how you like come up with different concepts, different art style, you know what I mean? Plus, you know, all of the fails that I had were lessons. They weren't just failures. They weren't just like, oh, trash. You know, they were a lesson, and you know, my work was better for it after that. So if I failed on something, I knew what not to do and what to do. Well, maybe not entirely what to do, but I definitely knew what not to do in a fail. So I feel like, you know, fails can be really discouraging. And they were totally discouraging for me, but after a while, because like I said, it took me a while to get here, it just started becoming more lessons and kind of like, okay, so I won't do that next time, and then I would be a better artist for it after that. So don't view your failures like trash or anything like that. They're lessons, and they're making your art better. So that's why I say, like, one of my biggest tips for resin, just go for it, because it's so fun. It is so exciting to pop things out. It's so fun to try different things, as long as you're being safe about it and wearing a respirator and gloves and in a ventilated space. It's so fun. And obviously, you know, being creative in any way, you know, whether you paint or whatever, is such, I don't know, an outlet for me at least, and it's therapy for me. So if you're feeling kind of afraid of it, I totally understand. And I do think you shouldn't just like throw yourself into it and just be like, oh, Heather said to just do it. But definitely, like, you know, if you have it, I've had people message me and say like, you know, I've had it sitting in my office for a while and I haven't, you know, used it. If you're ready, you have all the tools, the safety stuff, like you're ready to go. Definitely just do something small, you know what I mean? You could do a bookmark, you could do a coaster or anything like that. Just kind of like dip your toe in, see how it goes, and kind of go from there, because it's really fun once you get into it. So those are my 10 resin basics for now. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I hope that they helped you. I know that obviously these are like the basic things, and there's so many questions after this, but I just wanted to help you guys basically start out. Like, if you were thinking of trying out resin, I hope that this video helps you in kind of like, you know, getting the first few really important things in there and then kind of going from there. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Like I said, I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you're following me on Instagram. It is @Artsymadwoman, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. I love you guys so freaking much. You have no idea. And I will see you on the next video. Goodbye.